Hi, class. Welcome to Criminology Week 6. We're going to just a few things this week. I'm doing virtual office hours only, so just send me an email and we can set up a mutually convenient time. Always feel free to reach out for me or to me for anything that you need. This week, as you know, we have careers in the social sciences. So we have someone come from Career Services with all kinds of helpful information that I think you'll find useful. So I hope you're able to use that to your advantage and ask all the questions that you can possibly ask, internships, careers, and other types of resources that are available to you, and things that you can do with majors, minors, within the social sciences. And as I said before, I started the criminal justice and human rights certificate that you can get with your bachelor's degree. So when you get your BA, you also get a certificate in human rights and criminal justice. And so, it's something that you can look into. I'll talk about that more later on in the semester. So you'll get also your exam review study guide later on this week. And then next week on Tuesday, we'll have exam review day. And I'll answer all the questions that you have regarding your exam. As I said before, your exam review study guide, the first part will be key terms, concepts, and ideas that you need to know. And then your part two is usually an essay. And so, anyhow, I think in your case, we have our lecturer last week had a discussion board that will be part of that exam grade. And so, this week, right now, what I'll give a bit of a talk on labeling theory. And after talking on labeling theory, just kind of a review from last week, I'll talk about radical conflict theory and then a few words on the saints and the roughnecks. And so let me start off here then with a little bit on labeling theory. And as I said before in class, one of the things I like about labeling theory is it's a critical kind of a theory that didn't rely on Marx or the Marxists from largely the Frankfurt School in Germany. And so it was kind of like sociology's answer to being critical without using Marx, because most of critical sociology derives from the ideas of Marx and the Marxists, particularly the Marxists from the Frankfurt School in Germany. And so labeling theory, it combines two theoretical perspectives, both of which I like very much. Conflict theory, always looking at power, hierarchy, inequality. And that certainly has something to do with understanding crime, as we'll talk about in a little bit in this idea of criminality. And it also combines symbolic interactionism, so this emphasis on how, social interactions and construction of identities. Symbolic interactionism is concerned with the material world of symbols, what people give and what they give off, in their everyday presentation of self. And so symbolic interactionists look at people's roles and their scripts of how they go about performing everyday social life. And so labeling theory explains crime as a social process where people in positions of power are able to define others as criminal. And so, of course, we know that crime and even deviance is relevant. It's not a quality inherent in any given action, but a quality bestowed upon an action, usually by outside observers. And so for the case of crime, a person becomes a criminal not based on the act itself, but when they are labeled as criminal by someone in a position of power. And so Becker, by the way, Howard Becker is one of the, I think, framers, one of the founders of symbolic, of labeling theory, rather. In one of his books, I used it for my deviance class. It's called Outsiders, and it's probably the definitive text on on labeling theory and deviant. So I really like it. But nonetheless, he labeling theory focuses on primary deviance as behavior that violates a social norm or a law, but it's temporary. It's often trivial. It goes unnoticed. No problem, right? So a person who I don't know, steals something from Walmart or something and never gets caught, or someone engages in tax evasion, something minor. And so primary people that engage in primary deviance do not get to be seen as deviant. They don't understand themselves as deviant or criminal, and they're not interpreted as such. So as a result, they don't internalize behavior to their identity. Of course, I'm right here. When I talk about labeling theory, I'm tailoring it to fit our criminology class here. Um, Labeling theory can be used, in classes like deviance and all kinds of actually sociology classes where labeling theory can be applied. So I'm kind of giving a criminology bent here in this discussion. Anyhow, secondary deviance is a behavior that continues over time, where people become identified as criminal and end up being labeled and stigmatized as criminal. So, for example, somebody's arrested for drug possession. They become labeled as a drug offender, and they continue to engage in these activities. And eventually the person internalizes this criminal label, and it becomes part of their understanding of the self, or they're part of their self-concept. In other words, they internalize these, the way other people look at them and the way other people label them. And oftentimes this kind of reinforced, once you're labeled and stigmatized, it becomes like this self-fulfilling prophecy when you internalize this label and continue to engage in the act. And then you develop a criminal career where the secondary deviance becomes sustained. The criminal label becomes a person's primary role. That's basically becomes their occupation. And they understand themselves as criminal. And another key idea with this, towards the end of labeling theory, is radical non-intervention. This especially applies to looking at delinquency, especially, but really all people, felons, etc., but especially kids, because once you label a kid and make a kid a social pariah and you stigmatize them, that can have far-reaching consequences for that person's life course. And so radical non-intervention is the solution proposed by a lot of labeling theorists, especially regarding criminal and or delinquent behavior. The idea is avoid labeling people, and if any labeling does occur, it should be done without any type of discrimination on like race, class, gender, things like that. But the point is, do not label people. Try to avoid it under most conditions. Labeling can prevent people from making the natural transition into more socially acceptable or law-abiding roles. But once you label them and cast them as an outsider, an other, an inferior, it's hard to come back from that once you've been ostracized and considered a social pariah, a menace to society. Hillary Clinton's super predator, as she referred to young black men. And so some major points of labeling theory: everyone engages in rule breaking. Most people at some point engage in behavior that can be considered criminal. I'm sure people in this class, something, could be downloading patented content, underage drinking, whatever. Almost everybody engages in rule breaking behavior. And so we have to understand then that even though everybody engages in rule-breaking behavior, only some people are labeled as deviant or criminal or as a delinquent. Crime is always politically defined. Obviously, in any type of society, you can't understand the nature of crime without looking at its political and economic system. If you don't understand political economy, you can't understand crime. It's just that simple. And so one has to have a good beat on what's going on in the political and economic arrangements of society in order to understand this thing that we call crime. And so in many ways, crime is politically defined. Certain groups hold the power, a ruling class, a power elite, and they're able to decide whether or not certain acts are criminal or not. Certainly when Frederick Engels was writing about the conditions of the working class in 18th century England, He was looking at a lot of the laws that were passed that basically criminalized not going to work. So if you didn't go to work for the capitalist in the factory, those awful, horrible conditions that paid poverty wages, you could get arrested for things like loitering or vagrancy, and that's why a lot of those laws come out to keep people going to these, to their awful jobs, basically. And if you don't go to your awful jobs, then you basically become a criminal. Um, I think a good example of this, by the way, was Chablis' study of the Saints and Roughnecks that shows how class can influence who gets labeled as criminal despite similar behaviors. As a matter of fact, maybe I'll say just a couple of things on on the Saints and the Roughnecks now, if I can find it here. Give me a second. Saints and Roughnecks. I'm gonna get back to that. I'll get back to that in a minute. Let me go on with labeling theory. Um, and so another concept is, so major point, everyone engages in rule breaking, crime is politically defined, and then the criminalization process. And it's important to look at the process. Labeling theories focus on how crime is created and defined and how a person goes through a process in order to become criminalized. So sociologists then would examine that take on this labeling perspective, examine the social and political processes by which laws are made, applied, and enforced, and how these processes label certain individuals and turn them into from good standing citizens to social pariahs. Um, so some premises: primary deviance, people engage in rule-breaking behavior that goes unnoticed. Labeling and public discovery: if an act is discovered by authorities, then a person is publicly labeled as such, a felon, a convict, and this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that the person internalizes these labels from outsiders, and they begin to see themselves and understand themselves as this new socially disgraced person. So once a person is labeled a career criminal, they continue engaging in crime, even though it receives societal rejection, until it eventually becomes, and this is another important concept, their master status, where a criminal label can become a person's master status, and that overshadows all other aspects of their identity. So your master status is your primary identity. So for some people who have egos, it might be I'm a professor at a university, or I'm a vice chancellor or something silly like that, right? Or that becomes their master status. Or sometimes someone's race can become their master status. Oftentimes, though, if you are a felon or a criminal, that oftentimes becomes your master status. Um, so, so we know that crime is socially constructed. Violence isn't, right? I mean, violence is something that's very real. Stealing is very real. But the concept of crime is socially constructed. It's made up, basically, and usually made up by people in power. And so the question is, who gets to decide what is the criminal and why are certain groups more likely to be labeled than others? It seems self-evident, but nonetheless, that becomes the key question of the labeling theorist. And so if you don't, whenever we look at any type of society and you see people labeled as criminal, the smart thing to do is to ask, well, who's the one deciding who is criminal and who's not a criminal? Obviously, the most dangerous criminals in our society are those people that sit at the centers of power in our political and economic institutions. They have by far, it's not even close, killed and stolen from much more, exponentially more than all the street crime combined. So they're not labeled as criminal, though. They are oftentimes even celebrated in the culture, especially in American culture. And so the other thing I wanted to bring up is the idea, I think important in labeling theory, is the idea of the social degradation ceremony. This is kind of the formal process by which a person is publicly destroyed, usually within an institution. And so think about, the moment that you get arrested. If you get arrested, all of a sudden, you are a good standing member in society, and then once you get arrested, you're put against the wall. some uh, some person in a costume touches your body all over, feels you all over. Then they take out chains and they put you in chains and they escort you to the back of a car, depending on what they're accusing you or suspecting you of. They may or may not read your Miranda rights, which is another part of this degradation ceremony, where you're publicly humiliated, and then you are brought into a facility that warehouses human beings in cages, and your bodily autonomy is taken away from you as you are fingerprinted against your will based upon coercion, and you are processed into a cage where, if you have money, you can leave that cage, and if you do not have money, you must remain in that cage. So this is part of that whole degradation ceremony, where a person is symbolically moved from being an outstanding member of society to one who is socially disgraced and turned into a pariah. And so their previous identity is stripped away, um, and they become this new identity. So new prisoners undergoing a ritual of being stripped of personal belongings, given a prison uniform, assigned a number. This is another example of a degradation ceremony. Um, okay, and so again, case in point though, for the labeling theorist again is this radical non-intervention to avoid labeling people, and of course we could see what happened with the Saints and the Roughnecks on this. Okay, let me move on to, let's see here. Yeah, let me move on to the talk on radical theory. Let's see here, radical theory. Yep. So this is basically radical and conflict theory go together. So I'm going to talk a bit about that right now. So radical theory, a little bit late coming to the United States. I would say the heyday of that was the 1960s, especially people like C. Wright Mills. Paul Lazarsfeld, Robin Merton, people like that were around, and they were, more, I would say, kind of leftist, progressive, more so than C. Wright Mills at the time. But once C. Wright Mills started moving in a different direction, he became, I think, further left than people like Merton, who are probably considered conservative today. So radical theories of crime emerged in the United States around the 1960s, 70s, and started to analyze capitalism through this more of a Marxist lens, where they began to argue that crime and transgression reflects class struggles and systemic inequalities inherent in capitalist system. Now, of course, one thing when I say transgression is kind of like a form of deviance, but it's deviance with like intent, deviousness with like purpose. So anybody can be a deviant; they don't have any purpose or any intent; or just be deviant to be deviant. But transgression means like deviant, but with a political purpose or some type of intent, some type of subversion to fight back against power and authority and social control. And so that's transgression. And so some fundamental concepts or important concepts here in this kind of radical conflict perspective is that, the whole history of crime and class struggle and capitalism has to be seen in a historical perspective. Even Marx writing for the everyday person. This was Marx's most simple writing. Was his Communist Manifesto, and he said that basically we can understand history as a series of class struggles. In earlier times, you had patricians versus plebeians, lords versus serfs, free people versus slaves, and obviously the oppressed group oftentimes committed what the oppressors viewed as criminal behavior, but really these oppressed groups were acting out against their structural subordination in a class-based society that we have today. So modern bourgeois society simplifies these struggles, though, into two major classes, where we have the bourgeois, the ruling class, the owners of the means of production, those people that make all the decisions, that control the rules, that control social policy. Americans don't. 90% of Americans have been completely disenfranchised from participation in their society. And so, outside of labor, they're free to sell their labor. But out of making decisions that influence social policy, Americans have been disenfranchised. Only maybe 10% of Americans with extreme amounts of wealth can influence social policy. And so you have the bourgeois. These are the people that own the earth's resources, and they own the means of production, and they also are the ones that are central to the political decision making. And then you have everybody else, us, the middle classes, the working classes, the proletariat. And so, as Marx once said, the history of all hitherto, until now, existing society is the history of class struggle. So the core idea of radical theory is a critique of capitalism, and again, that crime reflects class struggles and the oppressive nature of capitalist system, especially the working and middle classes fighting against the masters of what Adam Smith called the masters of mankind, the owners and the rulers of society. So, according to radical theorists, crime can be seen as a form of rebellion by the oppressed against the oppressor, against the oppressive conditions of those people that sit in the upper echelons of power in a capitalist society. Some basic assumptions of radical theory. Most behaviors, including criminal acts, are seen as products of class struggle between bourgeois and proletariats. The capitalist system is a primary driver of class division. So just like India has a caste system, the United States has something very similar. It's a class system, and it creates conditions that lead to crime and transgression. The bourgeois control all of our societal institutions, from our legal, from our political, social, cultural, and economic institutions. And they maintain their power and keep the proletariat in a subordinate position. So basically, the ruling class, they control all of our social institutions, and they use this as vehicles, as weapons of class warfare to keep the subordinated people in their place, to keep the rabble in their place, so they can maintain their positions of power and control. And another way, by the way, is to see and understand for example, the criminal justice system is, capitalism. It must have an industrial reserve army of unemployed people to keep wages low, because the capitalist wants to extract as much labor from the human meat and not have to feed it, not have to give it anything or give it very little, and so. So what happens under such conditions is that the capitalist wants to make sure that there are poor and homeless people that want jobs, so that the people that work for them, that they're extracting the labor from their meat, from they're extracting wealth from their labor, wealth from their meat. If those people complain and talk about safe working conditions or better pay, you can just sack them, and then you can recruit from the industrial reserve army. That way, you keep the workers, people like you and I, you keep them precarious. You keep them uncertain. You keep them insecure. That way, they don't talk about safe working conditions and better pay. And so that's a system of control that the bourgeois use. And so anyone who acts out against that is considered a criminal. Crime is also seen as an accommodation. Lower class, working class, middle class individuals might engage in crime as a response to oppressive conditions that are imposed upon them. Then the ruling class, of course, use artificial judgment, create artificial crimes, and use artificial judgments to control certain groups and situations. So, for example, when you do have people that are part of that industrial reserve army that are unemployed, they're not making any money. So how do you take meat or bodies that's not making money for the corporations? Well, what you have to do is create a lot of laws, loitering, marijuana laws, drug laws, something silly, things that pose no threat or danger to society. And you have to criminalize those bodies, those pieces of meat that are not being productive for a corporation. And once you can criminalize those bodies, now you can put them in cages of despair, and you can enslave those bodies. And once you enslave them in the vast American penal colonies, then you can now make those enslaved bodies wealthy for corporations, and that's exactly what the bourgeois wants. So one way that the bourgeois takes what they call unproductive people and make them productive is by criminalizing them and enslaving them and throwing them in a cage and forcing them to work for Walmart and other types of corporations. Good for the bourgeois, good for the political elite that serve the bourgeois, but bad for the American people. Uh, Terms to note: class conflict is known as ongoing struggles between the middle and working classes and their oppressors, the ruling class. Also, another key idea is the surplus labor. It's kind of what I was just describing, that capitalism creates a surplus population of unemployed people that are unnecessary for production, and these people are marginalized and, like I said, usually criminalized and then put in cages and then forced to work. And also that capitalism operates on ideology. It's hard to get most people to go along with the oppressive conditions of a capitalist society where people are forced to exchange, to trade their mind and their body to a master in exchange for a wage. Most people don't like that. In fact, a lot of Republican conservative Americans in the 1800s believed that wage work was chattel slavery, and they thought it was anti-American, and they were against it. So it took a long time to drill in people's heads that being a wage slave is a good thing, and this is something acceptable. Yes, of course, you should sell your mind and your body to a superior in exchange for a wage. Of course you should do that, so it becomes normal. This is how ideology works. Ideology is a term that explains it explains the way the ruling class propagate their ideas to the people. And so once people receive the propaganda through the news media outlets, the five cartels that own the media in the United States, people come to accept their material relations of production, that is, their subordinated position to a master class as natural, normal, and inevitable. In fact, our entire society now basically works in ideology. Ideas that express the interests of the powerful against the masses. So no thoughtful person, according to this thinking, would ever go along with this oppressive system unless they believe in the ideology. In other words, unless they believe in the ideas of their master ruling class. And most Americans do. Most Americans believe in the ideas that the masters, their superiors, have told them to believe. And those ideas, the ideas of the ruling class, are propagated through our media and our educational systems. And so people come to look at our existing society as, again, natural, normal, and inevitable, the only way things can be done. And so that's why people don't question it. And once people question it, and people have. In the 1960s, people started questioning the system. And when they started questioning the system, they didn't like what they're seeing going around. Vietnam War, the United States engaging in a war crime, entering into Vietnam's civil war, and invading their country and killing a bunch of people. One of the greatest war crimes of the 20th century, according to many scholars. People fighting for animal rights, environmental rights, women's rights, civil rights. And so when people started questioning the system, that's when the ruling class sick other members of the working class. The police are generally members of the working class of the United States. So they send the working class to go beat the heads and crack the skulls of other members of the working class who are fighting for better conditions, who are fighting for environmental rights, union rights, fighting against war, for women's rights, etc. And so generally Marxists argue that education and the media perpetuates ideologies that deceive the working class and the middle class, that deceive all of us, leading us to accept and conform to a social order that basically screws us and undermines our real material interests in society. So a Marxist approach to crime, deviance is often a response to inequalities and power imbalances inherent in a hierarchical capitalist system. Those who control the means of production, who control the wealth, and also who make all the political decisions, wield all the power over societal norms and laws. And so crime results from the alienation and demeaning work conditions um, that people experience in a capitalist system. The role of the nation state is to protect the interest of the opulent, to protect the rich and the powerful. So the state creates laws that reflect the interests of the ruling class to maintain their class positions in society and to maintain their social control through coercion. Um, and then, of course, there's unequal access to justice. Social class obviously influences legal outcomes. If you're not wealthy, you can't really defend yourself in court. And so, when police often arrest people, they'll put, you know, they might be arrest them for one or two charges, but they'll put 5 or 6 or 7 on them, knowing that they're going to go to court. They're going to plead guilty to 2 or 3 of them. The rest are going to get dropped. They're going to pay a fine or go to jail for a little while, and that's the end of that. The rich don't have to worry about those things. The poor do, because they have no ability to represent themselves. So in many ways, then, the criminal justice system is a predatory instrument that the ruling class use to attack the American people who are not rich and opulent. And so, conflict theories, economic interest, key ideas, economic interest in crime, economic and class interest influence definitions of crime. The law serves as a tool to dominate class, to maintain social control and suppress the threats suppress threats to their interests. So the law is not to protect and to serve, that you read on police cards or anything like that. But according to these more radical conflict theorists, the law is a tool of domination. Again, to maintain control, to suppress the dangerous classes, to suppress people that try to civilize society for workers' rights, again, women's rights, civil rights, etc., fair working conditions, health care, things like that. And of course, when we look at crimes of the ruling class, I've said this a few times, but criminology and the criminal justice system largely ignores ruling class crimes. I'm not just talking about white collar crimes like fraud or embezzlement or something, whatever. I'm talking about ruling class crimes. Those are crimes, environmental crimes that put drill and frack and cause children to have cancer, the bombing of people all over the world. I mean, these are real crime. Ponzi schemes that we see, too big to fail, banking, home and loan crisis, things like that. These were major crimes perpetuated by the powerful, yet they receive no scrutiny among the criminal justice system or criminology professors. Yet the total focus of crime is usually on crimes of the poor, crimes of the institutionally weak. And so crime can also, and under these conditions then of class struggle, crime is basically a rational response to an irrational economic system, political and economic system. So a conflict theorist would argue that many crimes are rational responses to social and economic inequalities rather than being pathological, like is generally thought of in our popular imagination. One of my favorite articles, by the way, was Stephen Spitzer's article on looking at crime and deviance from a Marxist perspective. And so Spitzer talks about the production of deviance and argues that capitalist economies create surplus population through technological advancements and globalization. And so this is like the non-working population, right? That's the surplus population. So businesses replace skilled workers with less skilled ones and move jobs to lower wage countries. And that's another prospect. In the 1950s, there was a lot of manufacturing. Those corporations left the United States, went all over the world in search for cheaper raw materials and cheaper labor. And this created a massive surplus population. And so the capitalist system, it'll temporarily, not so much anymore, but use social welfare and criminal justice systems to manage and control the surplus population, preventing potential threats to the system. And so the criminal justice system becomes a tool of control to manage this surplus population, contributing to systemic issues in this kind of capitalist system. And so the growing criminal justice system may contribute to a crisis in capitalism and potentially lead to a transition to socialism. At least that's what Marx, something that Marx would, the Marxists, not Marx so much himself, but the Marxists pretty much argued that people could overcome this, that basically capitalism sows the seeds to its own destruction. It births the baby that's going to eat it. So as we move forward in history, the ruling class, the political and economic elite, they become smaller and smaller and smaller, but much richer and more powerful. And we, the proletariat, become larger and larger and larger, but less powerful. But eventually, there'll be so few of them and so many of us that we can just say, I tell you what, we're just going to take over the means of production. We're going to take over the wealth and recreate a more equal society that reflects the interests of all of our brothers and sisters. And so Marx, in many ways, was an optimist, unlike a lot of our other social theorists. Just a few words then, because I think this applies to the study of the Saints and the Roughnecks. Just an overview. The Saints were 8 upper middle class boys engaged in criminal behavior like truancy, vandalism, fighting, drinking, whatever, but maintain a positive image in the community and of themselves. The Roughnecks were 6 lower class boys involved in similar criminal acts, but received negative attention and frequent police interactions. And so the findings, despite similar behaviors, the Saints, being more middle class, they were not labeled as criminal, and they went on to more successful careers, while the Roughnecks, who were negatively labeled and stigmatized, they faced continued criminalization and struggled with the law, even though their behaviors were basically the same. They were just as deviant and just as delinquent and just as criminal, yet one had more cultural capital, being middle class, and the other who had working class capital. So one didn't get stigmatized, one got stigmatized, and that stigmatization led to a process of criminalization and social stigma. And so labeling and social class, which is, this was a British theorist. American theorists don't talk so much about class. So labeling and social class influence criminal or career trajectories and perceptions of crime. All right, so I'll end here. Just some basic principles of radical theory. Conflict on values. Society is characterized by conflicts over basic values and interests, not a consensus. Class division. Society divided into 2 main classes. The ruling and the working classes, and in a sense, working classes means people that have to have jobs. So us. Definitions of crime: crimes are actions that violate basic human rights. The ruling class's actions, which is exploitation, pollution, killing, stealing, they're often not defined as crimes at all. Role of conventional criminologists. Conventional criminologists oftentimes reinforce the status quo through ideas like correctionalism or reformism. So if you ever hear a professor talking about corrections and reform, those are very orthodox status quo criminologists, at least to the radical theorist, all focused on controlling the workers, the American workers, or British workers. Canadian workers, European workers, whatever it might be, wherever there's capitalism. Radical criminologists, they challenge. So radical criminologists challenge official definitions of crime and study all behaviors that harm basic human rights, attributing them to the contradictions within a capitalist system. And they believe that basically the overthrow of capitalism and ushering in a more what they would consider more progressive, egalitarian, horizontally based society would resolve the problem of crime by eliminating this kind of class conflict. If class conflict is the cause of crime, then eradicating class conflict by eradicating class would solve the problem of crime. Nobody needs to go to jail. So the task of a radical criminology is to promote the overthrow of these class antagonisms between the ruling class and the workers, replacing capitalism with a new type of economic organization that better fits all of our social institutions and better fits the human race. Okay, I mean that's the basic ideas of radical conflict theory. Again. Thank you very much, and anything you need, just send me an email, and I look forward to our exam review on Tuesday of next week. And take care. Thank you very much.